and there's nothing you can do about it. Tell your neighbor, God loves you, and there's nothing you can do about it. Amen? And that ought to be the way that we share in our life together, that we love each other, and there's nothing anybody can do about that. And we're going to be talking a little bit about community this morning, about a community of grace. There's a lot of ungrace in the world in which we live, isn't there? A lot of messages that only if you reach this level, or only if you look like this, or only if you live like this, are you really somebody. We understand that as children of God, baptized as God's beloved children, we are somebody. And so is everybody else around us. They are somebody too. Amen. Amen. So now, out of all the somebodies out there, maybe you know somebody like this. There's a young man who is enamored of a young woman, and their relationship is going fairly smoothly, but he wants to take it up to the next notch. And so he decides he wants to do something to impress her with that desire. And he decides, well, gosh, what can I do? And he decides, I'm going to get her some jewelry. Right? I'm going to get her some diamond jewelry, and she will surely know that I am interested in moving this relationship on to another level. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Well, then this fellow goes to the jewelry store. And he sees all of the jewelry that he thinks would say what he wanted to say to this young lady. And he realizes, wow, this is going to be expensive. If I do this, this is going to cost me a whole lot of money. And then he gets to thinking, what if it doesn't work out? And I've spent all that money, and I got nothing to show for it. He says, well, maybe there's a less risky way to show my intentions. Y'all ever heard of cubic zirconium? As a fake diamond. It sort of looks like it. It sparkles like it. If you don't look too close, you mistake it for a diamond. So he buys some jewelry that if it were real diamonds would blow her socks off, but he doesn't have to put as much money into it. You know anybody like that?
No.
You see, we all want something deep, but we're afraid to give what it takes to get to that. And that's true in relationships with our spouses, that's true in relationships with our friends, our children, and it's also true in our relationship with the Lord and our relationship with one another here in the church. If you want to have something real, you got to be real. If you want to have something that's worth something, you got to invest something. And the choice that we all have in every relationship is when it comes to that point where it just stops being polite and where it needs to start getting real, are we going to move into that territory? Or are we going to settle for fake diamonds that look like real relationship but don't have enough investment in them to be the real thing? Now, Jesus is talking about this type of relationship in the passage that we just read, where he gives some practical advice about how to deal with when things start getting messy and real in the life of a church. You know, churches can be places of what Scott Peck, the psychologist, calls pseudo-community. You know what that word pseudo means? P-S-E-U-D-O. You hear it sometimes, pseudo-journalists or fake news, in other words, or, pseudo this or pseudo that. Pseudo is fake, right? Pseudo community is fake community. And unfortunately, churches can be places where there's a whole lot of pseudo community going on. Where the prayer chain is really more about gossip. Where people say to each other, "How are you doing?" And then the person says, "Well, I'm all right." And then it just goes from there. Where we pretend to know each other, but don't really know each other. And where when it gets real, we don't really deal with it. Instead, we ignore it. We seethe inside. And maybe we'll tell a few other people about it, or if we get really bent out of shape, we might send a passive-aggressive email with copies to the preacher and maybe even to the bishop. Right? I mean, this is all pseudo-community. Where, because it's hard to be in real community, we settle for something that sort of feels and looks like it. But when you really look at it close, it's not the same thing. Now, Jesus is giving us an antidote to pseudo-community in this passage. He says something really simple, but profoundly difficult. And part of the reason we don't do it is because it is hard. Community is difficult. He describes one of the absolute essential ways for us to move beyond pseudo-community into something more real and radical. He says, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when two of you are alone. See, our first impulse when we get hurt by somebody is to tell somebody else about it, right? And that's very understandable. But what Jesus tells us to do is that if somebody hurts you, or if you feel like they've hurt you or sinned against you, and that's all in the eye of the beholder. Maybe just because you think they have doesn't mean they have, right? But if you feel that someone has sinned against you, go and talk to that person. What a novel concept. Don't put it on Facebook. Don't tell your friend. Don't even sometimes talk to the preacher unless you want the preacher to help you to talk to that person. I don't mind you coming to me and saying, this happened. But it's not just so I can get on your side. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's so I can help you go and talk to that person. Right? Go and talk to the person. And then he says, if that doesn't work, then bring a couple people with you. And he says about it in terms of that they can be witnesses. And there's an ancient biblical tradition that says, yes, you go with other people because you need witnesses. But what we need to understand is that these are not witnesses who are on your side necessarily. They're people to hear the whole situation. And maybe they might see something about you that you need to see. You understand what I'm saying? But the whole goal, as Jesus says, is to gain that brother or sister back. This is restorative. It's not accusative. It's not punishing. It's for restoration. Now, as Trexler, then he says, if it doesn't work with the 2 or 3 people, bring them before the whole church. And then treat them like tax collectors and sinners, right? And like I said, remember how Jesus treated them, right? But as Jeremy Trexler, who talks about the pseudo-community, the Peck's idea of the pseudo-community, he points out pseudo-community hurts the church because of its tendency to get us to shy away from the conflicts that harm the very community we're trying to protect. He says, many of our worst conflicts in the church happen because at some point someone had the opportunity to say, hey, can we talk? And nothing was ever done. And now things are worse because they didn't deal with it. You think things get better by you ignoring them? Sometimes they do. But how about a toothache, you know? Is the toothache going to get better while you're just ignoring it? It's the same way it is in the church. And by way of example, I kind of want to share a little bit of an experience a friend of mine told me about. I've had a similar experience, maybe some of you have as well. This fellow was telling me how he had come to that point where he felt like he needed to have a conversation with his mother about the fact that the time had come for her to hand over her keys and stop driving. You ever had that experience? Some of us are living in fear of that conversation ourselves, right? But his last ride with his mother at the wheel had been a heart attack-inducing NASCAR-like ride through town that made it clear that the time had come. And so he sat down with his mother. He says, Mom, can we talk? He said, we're concerned about you. We're concerned about your driving. And very understandably, Mom wasn't ready to hear any of it. But what she said to him is, she said, stay out of my business. You ever had that? You talk to somebody about a problem, that's none of your business. Well, then they said, well, no, you know, Mom, you got to understand, this is our business, because who's going to get the call when you have the accident? And guess what? It's not even just our business. It's everybody's business, because there are other people out on the road with you. That's how it is with sin in the church. Especially when it comes to how we treat one another. It hurts everybody. It's everybody's business. Now, we can overdo that, and there's plenty of people who are very ready to point out all the sin that they see in other people's lives. But that doesn't take away from the fact that situations happen in the church. If they are ignored, they'll grow like a cancer, and they will do far more damage than you would ever imagine if they are unconfronted. Maybe sometimes we need to have people who take us aside and say, I'm concerned about you. Maybe you need to let go of the keys you are gripping so tight. In a little while, we're going to share a meal at the Lord's table. But before we do that, you'll notice in the ritual of the United Methodist Church, it fits in with rituals that have been going on for 2,000 years in the life of the church. There's always two things that we do when we come to the Lord's table before we even think about inviting people, right? First is we say a prayer of confession, right? And we confess to God and to one another. And then we forgive one another. Now these are rituals. And like every ritual, you can just go through it and it doesn't mean anything. But it's intended to cause us to think. And maybe before we come to worship, do some work. But that's the first thing that we do, is we confess to God and to one another. Christians have been doing that for 2,000 years. And then another thing we do is we pass the peace. Right? Right after we have done the confession and the forgiveness part, we do the passing of the peace. Now, some of y'all young men, this is not just a time to hug that cute woman that you've been sitting next to. That's not just what the peace is all. It's not just a social time. It's not just a precursor to coffee hour. It's reconciliation being ritually reenacted. Again, telling us that this is work we need to be always about, not just when we ritualize it on Communion Sunday. So we're going to do that just like we always do. We're going to be ritually reenacting and reminding ourselves of the need to forgive one another and be forgiven, and to be reconciled to one another before we can go and sit at the family table for dinner with Jesus as our host. Doesn't mean you have to work everything out. But we all know that dinner is so much easier when all the things that need to be said to your family have already been said. Digestion is a little easier when all that's taken care of. So when we come to the table today, I pray that we will come with that spirit of forgiving and being forgiven and being reconciled with one another and with the Lord. And so we will come with joy to meet our Lord at the table. Amen.
Amen.